Good afternoon and welcome to our first MED virtual panel of the year. I'm Francesco Rocchetti, Secretary General of ISPI and the curator of the Rome Dialogues, the annual initiative on the wider Mediterranean co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. The 11th edition of the conference will take place later this year in the fall, but we are here today to have an outlook of what will happen in a region which has seen in the last few years quite some things and problems and evolution. The year that just ended has been pivotal. It's been a pivotal one with the geopolitics of the Middle East reshaped by a new war in Lebanon, dynamics of escalation between Israel and Iran, and the collapse of the Assad regime. As we gather today to discuss, as I said, the key trends for 2025, a fragile ceasefire in Gaza is in place. The re-elected US president is outlining his policies towards the Middle East. And any prospects of the region's future, both, I would say, geopolitically and economically, are clouded with many uncertainties. We will delve into these uncertain prospects with a very exceptional lineup of speakers. Jihad Azur, thank you for being with us, Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF. Rola Dashti, Under-Secretary General of the UN and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. Thank you for being with us. And last but not least, Susan Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Thanks for being with us today and welcome again. So let's begin our discussion. We have about 45 minutes and I will begin with some questions for you. And then there will be time for a quick Q&A open to the audience. First, Jihad Azur, I'll begin by you to have an outlook of the region. As you frequently say at the IMF, the region is often characterized by significant economic diversity. And this is what you also said in your latest regional economic outlook. But I'll ask you what specific trends are likely to define the economic trajectories of these sub-regions and diverse economic regions that we see in the MENA in 2025, and of course, how will the varying levels of resilience among oil exporters, importers, and conflict-affected states shape the broader regional economic landscape?
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. I think it's a good time to start thinking about what are the trends and priorities this year for the region. 2025 is a year of transformation and year still of high uncertainties. Of course, the region is diverse, as you rightly said, and therefore the trends are going to be a bit different. What are the shapers of the outlook this year? Of course, geopolitical developments accelerated last year and are still also in movement this year and will have an impact on almost all parts of the region. Global trends in terms of the trends we see and global demand, global supply, interest rate, oil market also will have an impact on the outlook for this year. Three is what we see as global dynamic between global forces, what we call the geoeconomic tensions or fragmentation. How this will translate this year? Transformation. Let me start with the oil exporting countries, in particular the GCC. They are in the midst of transformation toward emerging as one of the global middle force economically in the world. They are heavily investing in diversification. They are also investing in new sectors, technology, climate, and so on. And they have been able to achieve on the non-oil sector higher level of growth compared to other parts of the world, as well as also compared to the other oil exporting countries. The emerging economies are in two groups. Those who are affected by the geopolitical developments, you mentioned them. There are opportunities for those, but are still in a very fragile situation. Lebanon, Syria, West Bank, Gaza, Palestine, but also other countries, other neighboring countries. The opportunity for those are to accelerate the recovery, the reconstruction. The challenge is stabilization. And the other challenge is the financing of a massive need for recovery. There are also sub-issues that are still very important: how to deal with refugees, how to deal with removal of barriers and re-establish connectivity between countries. You have another group of countries, especially those who are in the North African shore of the Mediterranean. There are developments. Europe is more interested in exploring opportunities. They play an important role as a connector between Europe and also Africa. And they have certain, I would say, challenges, but also some successes that we saw. How this would translate in terms of macroeconomic aggregates. We expect growth to recover this year compared to last year, to reach around 3.5%, which is equivalent to the average global growth, yet lower than what we see on average for emerging markets. We expect also inflation to remain under control, except in few cases. We expect that for emerging economies, cost of financing, access to finance will remain one of the major challenge. And broadly speaking, and this is something that maybe we will discuss later, the region is still growing below its potential. And the GDP per capita over the last 2 decades was lower than what the region needs in order to improve its social stability indicators. And this is due to the low productivity and also low productivity of capital. And those are priorities to focus on going forward. We see also that opportunities of greater connectivity within the region are emerging between oil exporting countries and the rest. We see also an opportunity today to address some of the long-lasting conflict issues. Yet, we are in a situation where uncertainties are still extremely high. Geopolitically, the tension between Iran and the rest, the stabilization of countries in transition, and also we are at the moment where the global tensions will reflect in a region that plays an important role as a connector. Stability in the Red Sea is very important. Stability in terms of relationship between major economic blocs will serve the region. Let me stop here.
Thank you. I will then turn to Rola Dashti, and I'll ask you, what are the biggest structural and development challenges facing the MENA economies this year? We often speak about untapped opportunities, untapped potential for the region. And can we say that in some parts, of course, will 2025 finally being the tapped year in which economic resilience will be boosted and social progress in a bit?
I will start by saying stability, stability, stability. In the absence of stability, I think what Jihad has been discussing and the opportunities that the region can benefit is at the stake. So political stability is a very key issue. And today we're seeing what's happened in Syria, the fall of the Assad regime, Lebanon, now we're having a president, but the issues in Lebanon, also with the Israeli, the fragile ceasefire in Gaza itself, but most importantly, Trump first, America first policy, and Trump policies also will have a big impact on the region's stability and the benefit where we're going to be reaping the benefit that Jihad has spoken about. Today, let's talk about what's happening. Recently, as all of you have heard, the suspension, 90-day suspension of aid, Trump policy on the region. It's going to have a massive repercussion effect on the region stability and impact in terms of the humanitarian aid that the region and the refugees. in terms for Lebanon, for example. Lebanon depends a lot on their Lebanese armed forces, on US support for the military. So if you don't have it, it will push a revival for Hezbollah to come, and then we're getting this country to become unstable and reviving a war. Talking about Jordan, talking about Yemen, that discussion and until waiting for the 3 months, I think the region is going to be affected negatively into it to benefit either in the economy itself or on the humanitarian part of it. Speaking about stability is extremely important because the gains that the GCC countries that Jihad was speaking about and the opportunities of the growth. If we're seeing a rise in tension between Iran and USA, this can escalate also, and we can see another escalation in the region of the GCC countries. And because there might be proxy confrontations that will impact the GCC countries, and this we're talking about another issue is not impacting only the region, but it could impact the world in terms of oil supplies and the growth of oil supplies and the prices of the oil. So also that relationship, how will it end between the Iranians and the USA also impact our region. So we go back into stability, potential. Now the region, as if we, I want to give you a number we've calculated. The region have, because of conflict that has been for the last decade or so in the region have lost almost $300 billion in potential foreign direct investment. That's a huge number. And also, which is extremely more important today, yes, the region is in three parts, you can say, countries who are rich, countries in conflicts, middle income countries, but still with the conflicts that we are having is that the region also, the GCC region also were impacted by these conflicts. And I'll give you certain numbers on this. That there was, during this period, the last 10 decades or so, there was a 6% decline in real per capita GDP in the GCC region. The governance of the GCC region, the debt per citizens, had nearly tripled in the last decade. So also, conflict does not help even the richest countries in itself. So today, let's talk about the social issues also. Now we're going to have an increase in the aging population. Within the coming 25 years, we will be having almost 65 million people over the age of 60. It will have immense pressure and needs on healthcare and pension systems that will need it, and there's not that much policies going into that area. Conflicts, what's happening? The region has spent in 2023 more than $200 billion in military spending. And now we're talking about Trump coming, and there's this relationship with the Saudis and the GCC. There will be extremely additional military spending instead of spending this on infrastructure, governance, and economic resilience and security itself. Today, we're talking about the countries that need revival. Okay, Syria is at a crossroad. We don't know. It's still at the beginning. Would it be in a fragmentation stage? Would it be a destabilized stage? Or in a prosperous, sustainable peace and prosperous recovery? Then you have Lebanon. Then you have Gaza. Who's going to finance this? All of these amounts of money. People thinking that GCC will be keeping on financing all of this. These are huge billions and billions of dollars. And the region itself, the GCC, are doing investments, as we heard from Jihad, on various fronts to develop their economy, to diversify their economy. So even these countries which needed a lot of investments of it, how much the GCC can tap on it, how much is, and so Trump policies and the US policies in this coming years is extremely important because this can impact the speed of recovery in the region. And this is extremely important. And so is Europe also has to play a role. If the recovery, we need to speed up the recovery into it. Not let alone on, as Jihad was talking about, is the debt burden. The debt burden on the middle income countries. It's a huge debt burden. Some countries are paying more than 60% of their revenues, government revenues, to pay servicing their debt into it. But now also hearing Trump annexation and moving the people from Gaza to be hosted by Jordanians and Egyptians, creating more pressure, creating a political instability into it. So we're talking about also not rich countries, not even the countries which are stable in the region, how we are going to deal with Palestine, how we're going to deal with West Bank and Gaza and the Palestinian issue will impact even the stable countries in the region and impact the prosperity of the people in that middle income countries. So politics is extremely tied to our economic prosperity itself, and stability becomes a very key issue in the region as we go along. So at the end of the day, yes, we do have all these social issues, but they are extremely linked. If you don't get in terms of youth unemployment, high youth unemployment, in terms of the aging population, in terms of poverty, inequality issues. But these, to bring economic prosperity to the region, you need stability itself. And for sure, this stability, political stability, is intertwined among the regions. It's not a country, it's all affected. So you need to have a regional prosperity itself and a regional integration, collaboration for stability, so to reap the benefits that Jihad was talking about and the better growth rates as we go along. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And well, stability. This is what we heard, and from the first two voices, you are economists. Let's turn to us political scientist, Susan Maloney. Of course, stability is not the first word, the first term that you would use when you think of the region in terms of geopolitical terms. And I'll ask you, how do you see this 2025 evolving, given that already in the first month we have seen quite a number of evolutions I would say some of those are very positive in the region after 2024 marked by very, I would say, sorrow news from the region as well.
Thanks so much. I will echo some of the remarks of my fellow panelists here. Even though I'm a political scientist rather than an economist, I think that we all recognize that this question of stability is key to both a political trajectory as well as an economic trajectory that is positive for the region. I think, from where I sit, the real question is whether we see an opportunity, as recent weeks have suggested, for de-escalation. Obviously, over the course of 2024, we saw really unprecedented escalation in the region in terms of the conflict that had long been brewing and erupted in a much more deadly fashion on October 7th of 2023. The types of escalations that we saw over the course of 2024, whether it was the Houthis in the Red Sea, or whether it was the multiple exchanges of attacks, direct attacks between Iran and Israel, were really unprecedented, and in many respects, I think, very, very dangerous, and brought the region to the brink, closer to the brink of an all-out war between the major powers of the region than we have seen in many decades. Early 2025 offers some positive signs, obviously not just the ceasefire itself in Gaza, but the fact that we saw both the Biden and the Trump administration officials working hand in hand in a way that is, again, very rare, almost unprecedented, to see an incoming administration and an outgoing administration so deeply involved in a partnership to try to end a devastating conflict. They managed to do that, to get that ceasefire after many, many months of efforts by the Biden administration, and of course the parties in the region who were directly involved. And now we have made it to a second stage of that that ceasefire, or at least the early signs that it might not hold have been avoided. So I think that's a huge positive development, but obviously there's an enormous amount of work that's going to have to be undertaken in order to hold the ceasefire and to go beyond just the ceasefire and critically the release of Israeli hostages, to see something that looks like a stable outcome, even on an interim basis for the Palestinians in Gaza. What forms of governance, who is going to be taking responsibility for security? Is there any prospect of clearing and then beginning to contemplate what reconstruction could look like? I think we're still very far from that kind of an outcome, although there have obviously been many plans and many parties in the region, including the Emiratis, who've been considering how they might become directly involved. But the unknowns about how Gaza recovers are still enormous, and the prospects for this ceasefire holding and actually enabling some space for even a political dialogue about what the future looks like is absolutely critical, because it also has the reverberating effects on some of the other players in the region, particularly Iran and its proxies, who have used the violence in Gaza as an excuse for mounting further escalation against the Israelis. So can the restraint on the part of the Houthis and others hold? It very much depends on what happens in Gaza itself. I think the other, big question is this generational opportunity that we have today in both Syria and Lebanon, to get some sort of a peaceful, stable outcome that enables both a political horizon, which is positive for the citizens of those two countries, and an end to the violence, which has done so much damage internally to Syrians and to Lebanese. This is going to be crucial, I think, for the long-term stability of the region, because if we are able to continue at least some positive developments in both Syria and Lebanon, a strengthened democracy in Lebanon, an end to the Assad regime, and potentially a broader reunification of Syria, then I think there is the potential for really positive reverberations for other countries in the region. But there are still huge uncertainties, and I think here both the role of Turkey and specifically in Syria, and what Syria's stability might mean for developments in Iraq, I think are incredibly important for those two countries. I wanted to at least flag one other big issue that I think is looming for the region, and this question of what happens between Iran and Israel. As I'd mentioned, we had these, a completely unprecedented exchange of attacks in both April and October. For the moment, the Iranians appear to be on the back heel. They have lost some significant influence in the region and deterrent power in terms of the relationship with Hezbollah, which has been heavily eroded by Israeli attacks in Lebanon. And of course, the Israeli attacks on Iran exposed how vulnerable Iran is to Israel, both in terms of airstrikes, which we saw, but also in terms of the covert activities, which managed to eliminate the political leader of Hamas when he was visiting Iran in August. And so, I think the real question is whether Israel will take advantage of this window of opportunity. There's a lot of dialogue and discussion among the national security community in Israel about this being a unique moment with a potentially supportive American president to try to, if not eliminate, because that would probably be quite difficult, but at least to set back in a historic fashion Iran's nuclear program through direct military action. I think that is going to be the debate that plays out over the course of this year. And whether the Netanyahu government does take that opportunity. I think the position of the Trump administration, which I know we want to talk about some more, is going to be, to some extent, not quite as predictable as many may think, because I think that President Trump has made it very clear he does not want to see American boots on the ground in the Middle East. I'll just close by noting there was a lot of discussion about demographic pressures and the debt burden on middle-income countries. And I think, outside of the headlines, we have to be focused on some of those middle-income countries and how Egypt, Jordan, and some of the other countries that have been directly affected by conflict navigate what may be a post-conflict period.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you especially for your remarks on Iran. We know you're, let's say, one of the most experts, American experts on Iran and America's policy towards Iran, and this is going to be, for sure, something crucial in the Trump administration, is posture towards Iran. I will go back to Jihad Azur, and since we spoke and you mentioned the ceasefire in Gaza and whether the ceasefire will hold. Of course, this will spark and has already sparked the discussion on the transition from conflict to recovery. And of course, from conflict to recovery is something that we have spoken a lot about. But I want to ask to Jihad Azur, how can especially policymakers address the immediate reconstruction needs while fostering long-term stability and development in this region?
Thank you. This is clearly a key issue for this year and for the next years. Here, there are more than one case at play, and there are different type of challenges. But quickly, I think there are three key pillars here to work on. One is restoring stability, and this requires to restore the core functions of the state: security, stability, also central bank functioning, as well as also other key functions of the state. Without stability, it's impossible to conduct any recovery or reconstruction. And here the cases are different between Syria, where you need to bring the different factions together, restore the core functions of the state. In Lebanon, where you need to repair them. In Palestine, you need to re-engage around a state that is functioning. The second pillar is restoring hope. Restoring hope is accelerate the support of humanitarian, protect people's life, restore livelihood in order to allow people to be able to believe in the future. And this would require support from international community, from also regional partners. And we hope that this will be in form of grants. Of course, in the current world, there are competing needs between different parts of the world where we have or we are exploring post-conflict recovery moments. Ukraine could be one, the region also, but are other parts of the world where there is a need for additional ODA. The third one is restarting the economies. And again, for Syria is how to move into a new economic model, build the foundations of an economy that is competitive. In Lebanon is how to address the large imbalances and the financial crisis, at the same time to rebuild the capacity of the economy to grow. And the same also for West Bank and for Gaza is to re-engage into an economic activity. Those are the three priorities, or those are the three pillars. But this cannot be done without an overarching element that is very important, which is how to govern all of that and the interaction between what is needed at home and what is required from the regional and international community. I think we need three things. One is to have a coordinated approach. I'm encouraged to see that in the case of Syria, there is a coordinated process. The international community is giving the benefit of the doubt and providing a framework whereby different stakeholders are coming together. I think this is useful. The issue here is we have new players coming. Turkey was mentioned by my colleagues, is a new player in this new regional order. Therefore, we need to find out a model whereby regional and international interaction can play positively in providing stability, but also in mobilizing resources. Two, any international assistance of this magnitude would require to have a very strong institutional and governance framework in order to avoid any misuse of resources, but also in order to increase the multiplier effect of the funding that is needed for those countries. And the third element that is very important is there is an opportunity today with the removal of those barriers is to increase connectivity. If the region wants to aspire to be one of the emerging power globally, one of the connectors that would somehow adjust and benefit from all the transformation that is happening globally, we need to have a strategy that takes into consideration the potential that one can create, the connectivity that could go to Europe, to Asia, to Africa from this part of the world. Those are priorities that require huge amount of effort, that they require all the institutional framework to come together in order to help achieve that. Is this feasible? Yes. Is this feasible with high probability? I would say not yet. I think we need to see more. We need to see more engagement. And also we need to come with a framework that would give sustainability to this. Because usually you have, in the first moment, high level of attention that gradually declines. And this is when you succeed in stabilization and you fail in recovery.
Well, thank you, Jihad. I will turn to Rola because you said, Jihad, we need to see more. And when we think about what we need to see more in the region, is of course economic diversification is something that we, of course, we have been studying, reading, and listening a lot. I'm guessing, I'm asking myself, and actually yourself, Rola, what we will see in this context this year, because of course, resilience, especially in very tense moments, and we think about the pandemic, the wars, comes, of course, from economic diversification in a region in which diversification is not the best asset we have.
What we will see, I think, by next year, let's say, a more connectivity among the countries in the region. And there will be good investments in connectivity, and we're talking about electricity here, which will be coming up among various countries in the region, and this will link the region together. On terms of diversification, you will see, okay, because as Jihad was saying, we have different, let's say, different groups, blocks in the region. Digitization, digital investment, you will see it a lot on this coming up from the GCC countries as part of their diversification. So you will find a lot of investments in cloud computing, energy-intensive industries, digitization, the infrastructure, that you will see a lot of the investments on that things. In terms of countries that will be, like we're talking about Syria or Lebanon, there will be infrastructure investments to start building these countries as we go into recovery. There is no question, at the end of the day, there will be job creation for our youth and various parts if the investments were done properly, and there's the environment of the investments on the region. But mind, it's extremely important when especially we're talking about Syria. And as there for sure, if Syria is going into this stabilized path, which is inclusive governance among them, then we need to focus much more on the local needs assessments, which I mean is that the economic triggers in the areas could be bringing the social cohesion and the social reconciliation among the Syrians themselves, different parts of Syria, by having different areas in Syria having different economic triggers. So when we're looking into support and economic recovery in Syria, we need to look into these areas and target. Certain areas might be small industries, other areas might be agriculture, other areas might be tourism. So you can't treat them as lump sum when you're targeting investments as it is. So this could be also smart targeting the economic investments in countries who will be recovering from conflict is extremely important to position itself as we move along. The issue becomes also, I always also link, debt is a big burden in middle income countries. Servicing the debt is a big burden. And a good portion of this middle income countries also depends on the aid and support of the US. I'm speaking about Jordan. Now Egypt is exempted from the aid suspension into it. So now you're putting Jordan, even if they're starting to go into the economic recovery, which they're depending on the aid to recover, to become sustainable, this will be drawing back and lifting back Jordan because in the ability to move forward on their plans of the economic recovery and modernization itself. So we are hoping interest rates in the US goes down. Can you imagine the region is waiting for the Fed to lower interest rates so that that burden gets to be lowered? Okay, and now policies, internal policies in the US indirectly affect the countries who doesn't have anything to deal with that. If inflation gets into the rise again in the US and interest rates starts to stay as it is or increase, then these countries will be impacted because any amount of fiscal space available will end up becoming, so that not to default, will end up becoming going to be spent on financing their, servicing their debt. So economic potential, there is a lot of opportunities in the regions to benefit in various diversification opportunities, but there is also global power, global circumstances that could impact them that we need to caution, and there is not that much cushion for them to move around and circulate because they are already tied in fiscal space into it. Am I hopeful for 2025? I'm always hopeful, okay, and we act hopeful in terms, we try to support member countries and position themselves to be resilient to any these types of shocks as we go along. There is a lot of potential. That region, if Syria and Lebanon and the Levant, as I said, the countries are going into this stabilized path, there is a huge investments that will be coming to this region. Having said, governance becomes a key issue. Institutional building becomes a key issue to reap the benefit of these huge investments that will be coming to the region in terms of various economic diversification and investments that it is. So our eye is also to build the institutions. Strengthening the institutions becomes extremely key to benefit from a stabilized route into it and reap the benefit of the huge investments that will be coming to the countries, especially I'm talking about the Levant countries. As we go on.
Well, thank you. You spoke about the connection between what's happening in the US and the region and in general in the rest of the world, because of course the world is interconnected. But in the last few years, we have been experiencing also the resurgence of some sort of protectionism, economic fragmentation, and what we call deglobalization. And I want to go back to Jihad to ask over the medium term, how do you see these trends influencing the MENA region, particularly I think in reshaping trade dynamics, investment flows, and growth strategies? Of course, as the beginning, the region is very diverse, and so I don't expect a unique answer, but how do you see this evolving in this year?
Well, clearly 2025 is a year of several transitions, and there are still high level of uncertainties on many fronts. Let me start with the first important element. Countries in the region are at the crossroad in terms of trade, in terms of flows of goods, energy, and services. Therefore, this is a role that in this new world configuration is challenged. We saw last year a drop of almost $7 billion of revenues from the Suez Canal for Egypt, for example. Therefore, any sustained global tension will have an impact. On the other hand, any potential economic transformation globally would benefit the region. And this is what certain number of countries are trying to play a game in order for them to benefit from that. We saw that GCC countries are working in accelerating their diversification, not only in new sectors, but also in new trading partners. They have accelerated their connectivity with different parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Central Asia, and more recently with Europe. Therefore, they are trying to position themselves as one of the emerging global connector. They have the infrastructure, they have the services, and they have the capital. They are also investing in new sectors, and this could help increase productivity, which brings me to the second important point for the region to benefit from these global transformation. You need to improve your capacity to attract investment. You need to improve your capacity to produce with higher value add. This requires to address the issue of productivity. We did recently several studies that showed that productivity is low, that showed that also capital productivity is low. This requires certain number of important reforms to deepen capital and increase the capacity to mobilize investment. This also, I think Rula mentioned this earlier, in terms of FDI, over the last decade, we saw a decline in the region, not only because of geopolitical tensions, also because of certain impediments that exist in the markets that are not allowing capital to come and invest. It means that we need to revise the role of the state and the size of the state. It means that the financial sector has to become more dynamic, and the overhang of the state over the financial sector has to also gradually be undone. It means also something that is very important in the region is to increase the capacity of inclusion of women and youth, including women and reducing the gap that exists with other emerging markets will, in the next 10 years, allow the region to create more than $1 trillion of output, reducing the youth unemployment that is relatively high and among the highest worldwide, would also provide opportunities for growth, but also for social stability and political stability. Therefore, the future will be determined by certain number of priorities. Structural reforms, it's very important for the countries in the region, rich and poor, open and closed, middle income or low income, to accelerate their structural reform agenda. 2, inclusion. Inclusion is a very important element, not only for social stability, but also for economic stability. And 3, address imbalances. Countries who have high level of debt, they need to reduce the debt overhang. Countries who are very much dependent on import, they need to improve their capacity to export, and so on. Those are priorities, and those priorities today will determine the future of the region. The last element that I mentioned earlier, regional integration. We have to change the model of regional integration that now should be based on more economic opportunities, business opportunities, removing barriers, create a space for a certain number of investment to become relevant. We were mentioning the connectivity issue on electricity, energy, and so on. Those are elements that could drive additional growth. We need also to think about how to reduce the risk premium. And this is something that also the region can think and can also find mechanisms for that. The last element that for me is very important, you cannot transform an economy with short-term measures. Economic transformations would require medium-term economic planning based on 3 pillars. Economic stability. Stability is the key for prosperity. 2, embrace transformation, and we are in a world that is accelerating those transformations very rapidly. And 3, you cannot live on your own. You need to understand the global trends, you need to adjust to those, and you need to embrace the economic transformations that the world is going through. When you are a middle power or small power, you are more on the receiving end, but also you have to be smarter and be able to accelerate your connectivity and your reforms. Otherwise, you will remain, I would say, on your own and sidelined in a world that is rapidly changing. Therefore, This year is a year of transformation, as I mentioned at the beginning, in real terms. And only through reforms the region can succeed addressing important issues. But also, there are currently certain opportunities that I think the world would like to see them materializing, because there is here an important stability priority for the world to come from the region.
Thank you, Jihad. I hear of transformation, but something that is not changing, even if the leaders of the country would like to change, is the American role in the region. We have been listening for quite some years from now the American leaders declaring that they would like to disengage from the region, and in a way or the other, the US is still the pivotal power within the region, and not only with, I would say, political power, but also military presence and power. And Susan, I'll get back to you to ask you a couple of questions on the situation. Of course, as you said before, Iran is going to be very important. What will happen between Israel, the US, and Iran will shape the region. But if you had to outline what could, in this first year of the presidency, the Trump administration do and not do, what you would put on your agenda?
I think it's a good question, and obviously we're all still trying to read the tea leaves, both from the appointments that have been made by the Trump administration to senior positions, to the early actions of the administration, both in the region and around the world, and at home as well, since those, as Rola noted, are impacting the region as well. And also just, what policies they've actually begun to articulate. So it's still very, very early days. And I think that there are a couple of key points to watch very closely. The first is that there are real contradictions within the administration with respect to foreign policy. Obviously, President Trump ran on a slogan of America First, and that has been a longstanding slogan and I think articulation of his view of the world, that really his priority is on strengthening the United States and investing in the United States and putting Americans first. But there is within that, underneath that broad tent, I think some real fault lines between those who advocate restraint in terms of American policy, in particular from the perspective that we need to focus on issues other than those that have consumed most of our debates over the course of recent years and recent decades: the transatlantic relationship, the U.S. role in the Middle East. The restrainers, in many respects, believe that the United States has been wasting resources, that we should not be responsible for security in Europe, that we should not be responsible for maintaining security particularly of oil flows, but more broadly across the Middle East. And President Trump himself has articulated that view. When he ran for president the first time, he talked a lot about the $7 trillion the United States had invested in Iraq and Afghanistan and the wars there and in the post-conflict situation. And, spoke to Americans about what it might be if those funds had been invested at home. So I think that is a powerful strain of the Trump position. But of course, the flip side of America First is those who believe, and I think this too is a position that the president holds, that America should be the dominant power in the world, and who believe that quite vociferously. And we see in the appointments that there are certainly some who come from a restraint position, particularly in the Pentagon. I think that there are those who advocate against any American military presence in the Middle East, that it should all be shifted to the Indo-Pacific region, because the real challenge to America, to the rules-based international order, and to our place in the world, it comes from China, and that we have been underspending and underinvesting and underdeploying in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that is a very powerful element of the Trump administration's approach to the world. But there will be, I think, this inevitable draw to get back to ensure, both because of the individual bilateral relationships with Israel and with other countries in the region, I think it will be very hard for even the Trump administration to fully disengage. But of course, it's not just what Trump does, it's how leaders in the region are interpreting what Trump has done in the past and what he may do in the future. And I think it's very clear to many leaders in the region that this is a transactional American president, and that the sort of abiding commitment that prior American presidents, both Republican and Democrats, showed to trying to ensure stability in the region, to trying to protect some of our partners and allies in the region, may not be something that we can count on in the future. And so I think that feeds some of what we've seen over the course of the past couple of years. The decision, for example, by the Saudi government to engage in a process of rapprochement with Iran. I think that was very much a reflection of the sense that, the United States did not come to Saudi Arabia's defense after the 2019 attacks on Abqaiq and Kharis that were attributed to Iran and its proxies. And so, this investment that the Saudis are making, both in their own defense, but also in potentially a more integrated region and a future relationship with Israel, is reflective of the sense that America may not be quite as reliable as it has been in the past. I think all of this will complicate the idea of the grand bargains that the Trump administration is looking toward. The idea of expanding the Abraham Accords to include the Saudis has been something that has been a high priority both for the first Trump administration, for the Biden administration, and for the current Trump administration. But obviously, October 7th has changed the terms, and the Saudis need to see some kind of a commitment to a pathway for Palestinian statehood. And it's difficult to see how the Trump administration will be able to extract that from the Israelis. It's also difficult to imagine that, the terms that were on offer during the Biden administration are going to be as palatable to any of the parties at this point. So I think that's going to be a much more difficult process, despite the fact that Trump is quite positively predisposed to the Saudis. There's also this idea that, maybe there's a grand bargain to be had with Iran. And there too, I think, one could imagine that Trump believes himself to be the world's greatest deal maker, and that he will attempt to negotiate with Iran. From my vantage, I see a lot of maneuvering on the part of the Iranian system to test the waters this time around to see what might be possible. Still there, I think, despite the fact that Trump might be willing to settle for something far less rigorous than what we had with respect to the 2015 nuclear deal or anything else, I think it's hard to imagine that both sides are going to be able to get to yes, because the ideological objections to any kind of tolerance of the United States remains so integral to the worldview of the Iranian leadership that I think even the symbolic sort of acceptance of a relationship would be too bitter a pill to swallow. And that would probably be the one thing that Trump would need. He would need a little bit of flag waving, which would be anathema, I think, to Iranian leaders. So we'll see. It will be a very interesting time, I think. And obviously, all of this will reverberate around the region as the fellow panelists have described.
Oh, thank you. If I can have a follow-up and take one of the questions that came from the audience, Susan. Of course, it's impossible to, in these years, to speak about U.S. foreign policy, not to mention China. And you mentioned China. How do you see China playing in the Middle East, given, of course, some moves that have been done in the past? You mentioned the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, but how do you see the U.S.-China, let's say, competition unfolding in the MENA, or if you don't see it? But I think these and the next year will be crucial also in this kind of evolution in case.
I think China plays a very important role in all of U.S. foreign policy and has for some time. I think there are a variety of factors. The first is that it will be critical from the Trump administration's perspective to try to ensure that there, as the kind of tech boom in the Gulf states in particular evolves, that China is ring fenced from some of the U.S. technology that might be accessed there, and so that would be, I think, a potential point of contention, because I think what we've seen from the perspective of the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others is that they want to have a strong economic relationship with a variety of world powers, and they don't want to have an exclusive American domain or an exclusive Chinese domain. And so I think that is going to be complicated and interesting. I think the larger question is just this question of whether or not the administration really does retrench U.S. military presence in the region, not just in Syria and Iraq, where we've already seen those trends underway for some time, but in terms of the readiness that the Biden administration showed to deploy battle carrier groups to the region in order to deter at least the early escalation of the conflict after October 7th, and at successive moments when tensions became high between Iran and Israel. If in fact the Trump administration is really determined to shift everything to the Indo-Pacific, that could leave all of America's partners and allies in the region more vulnerable to a resurgence if we see it from Iran and its proxies.
I would like to come back to Rola, and I hope to conclude on a positive note, asking, since you're a long-time advocate for women's rights, how do you see the situation unfolding in the MENA region? Do you see progress, and you see the point of hope in the region regarding women's rights, Rola?
Okay, we did have some progress in terms of in the economic sector, in the economic field, in the decision-making process, which is what I'm talking about. It's still lagging, and in certain countries we're going behind into it. There is a good increase in women access to education. The issue is that now we do have is there economic opportunities for these women? Our tertiary universities across the Arab region, majority of them are females, around between 60 to 70%. However, these invested in women, would they get the opportunities? There is not that much opportunities, and when you look at the high unemployment rates in the region among youth, you will find around 75% of the unemployed are females. So also there is this bias of who gets the jobs, despite that women are more educated sometimes than men, but there is this still this discriminatory, indirect discriminatory in the system for getting more women into even the ones who are looking for a job as we go along. The momentum is still in the private sector. We're not seeing a growth in women in the board members of private sectors, especially in the stock market companies. There we have a limited number, and there is not that much growth in this. We are seeing a growth in women entrepreneurs in the region as we go along. But as we say, you cannot have democratization without full engagement of women to reap the benefits of the half of the society. And this is where we have to have a lot of investments, and we have to move from issues of only economic empowering women and politically empowering women, but creating the opportunities to benefit from this empowerment. So empowerment is important, but creating the opportunities is as important. And this is where the region needs to be directed. And one last thing, I think I need to hit on to just talking about when Jihad was talking about a lot of transformation that is needed to be done. A lot of issues of reforms in the regions have to be done. We need to be mindful also that the middle class in the region is becoming shrinking, and they've been squeezed. Reforms are always hitting who pays the bill for these reforms are the middle class. The middle class are shrinking and squeezed. So we need to be cautious, okay, and to look into this class when we're doing the reform. Usually we go to the lower end, the poor people, and look into the social protection for them, overseeing the middle class and the impact of these reforms on the middle class. So our policies need to also to pay attention to this class who are reaping the burden of the reforms, so that to have a smooth reform than unstable reform. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jihad. Thank you, Rola. Thank you, Suzanne, for these words. I think you helped us a bit outlining how could the 2025 unfold. Well, I would say 2025 and some years ahead, given what we heard. Thank you for your contribution, for your voices, for your opinions. I think we had a fantastic panel together with us. So thank you again, and see you, I hope, the next edition of the Med Dialogues, Jihad, Rola, and Suzanne. Thank you.